The U.S.-Mexico War, which you're going to be hearing today, was a short, bloody, and obviously very successful war for the United States. Pretty much every battle in this war suggested to Americans the heroism and superior fighting qualities of the U.S. soldier compared to the Mexican soldier. You see up on the screen here a Currier and Ives print of the Battle of Buena Vista, which was the most famous battle of the war. In this particular battle, 5,000 U.S. soldiers defeated a Mexican army of 20,000 people. Now, both supporters and opponents of the war at the time seemed unified in the belief that this was a memorable and important war. An important moment in American history, one that marked really a turning point in the history of the United States and would shape the character of the future United States as dramatically as it had transformed it physically. In 1848, Captain James Henry Carleton wrote that, quote, "The Battle of Buena Vista will probably be regarded as the greatest ever fought on this continent, and it may be doubted if there can be found one that surpasses it in the history of any nation at any age." Now, Carleton was obviously wrong because, please let me just see a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the Battle of Buena Vista? Oh, you're great. Most people haven't, trust me on that. Now, while in Mexico, La Invasión Norteamericana exerted a powerful force in the political realignment of the late 19th century, the creation of a centralized state, and the forging of a common Mexican identity, the half-life of this war north of the border region was remarkably short. It was, in fact, wiped clean from national memory in the decades after the Civil War. Representations of even the most dramatic victories of the conflict, like the Battle of Buena Vista, disappeared from view, and veterans of the 1848 conflict struggled to gain public recognition and financial support from a public that had no heart for revisiting the halls of the Montezumas. Veterans struggled for years to obtain pensions on a par with veterans of other wars, and when they did finally gain pensions, they were accused of pension fraud far more frequently than veterans of other wars were. By the 50th anniversary of the war in 1898, politicians and historians felt comfortable writing a history of America's military past in which the war with Mexico and its veterans were absent. What's going on here? First, let me tell you about Mexican War veterans, and then I want to suggest why I think they were so aggressively forgotten. I'm not sure forgotten is the right word for reasons you'll see, but why they disappeared so much from public discourse in the second half of the 19th century. 72,500 of the 85,000 American soldiers who served in the war between 1846 and 1848 returned to the United States alive, and this gives actually the U.S.-Mexico War the highest fatality rate of any war that Americans are involved in. The twin ideals of the citizen soldier and of military service as the clearest grounds for citizenship were firmly grounded in the Republican, with a little r, political culture of the early Republic. So one might assume that these men would return to a hero's welcome and would reap the rewards of their sacrifice to the nation. Volunteer forces were, in fact, widely lauded in the national press during and immediately after the war, but as Paul Foose has written, for the most part, service in Mexico was a profoundly alienating experience for most soldiers. The Mexican War also had the highest desertion rate of any war, by the way. And the veterans returned to a country deeply divided over both the righteousness of invading and dismembering a weaker nation, a neighbor, and the implications of the Mexican territorial cession on the expansion of slavery. Now, the Civil War, which followed a mere 13 years later, made matters much worse. Even the most dramatic victories in Mexico paled in comparison to the epic engagements of the Civil War, and the accomplishments of the veterans of 1848 were likewise diminished. One engineer officer struck a tellingly apologetic tone when he recounted the Battle of Buena Vista for a newspaper in 1871, offering his account, quote, "with some hesitation because this battle, which appeared to us and to the country as of such great importance at the time, is now dwarfed into insignificance by the giant struggles of these latter days." Veterans of the Civil War certainly shared this opinion, and the Grand Army of the Republic had little time for veterans of the earlier war, unless, of course, those veterans fought for the North in the 1860s as well, and most of them didn't. Most of the veterans of the U.S.-Mexico War, if they did fight in the Civil War, ended up fighting for the South. Now, by the end of the 19th century, however, one might imagine that these aged veterans of the Mexican War would be ripe for veneration and public embrace. As David Blight, Nina Silver, and others have documented, the last decades of the century were a period of reconciliation and reunion, as Northerners romanticized the Old South, and both sides attempted to find common ground in the aftermath of the Civil War. Veterans of the U.S.-Mexico War took this reunion, pointing to the 1840s as a period when, in the words of veteran Gideon Pillow, we knew no North and no South. Veterans upheld their war as one of common united purpose and sacrifice. 1898 was, of course, the 50th anniversary of the end of the U.S.-Mexico War. Our ongoing outpouring of appreciation for veterans of the Second World War since the 50th anniversary of that conflict might lead one to imagine that the year of the Spanish-American War was marked by remembrances of the earlier war against Spanish speakers in the Western Hemisphere. But such was not the case. There was no best-selling publication about the Greatest Generation, no laudatory speeches in Congress, little public discussion about the U.S.-Mexican War or its veterans at all in the run-up to the Second War for Empire. Indeed, veterans continued to complain about their mistreatment and lack of appreciation, as they had for decades. Attempts in 1896 to get a congressional appropriation for a monument in Monterey, California, commemorating the 1846 capture by U.S. forces were undermined, just as had been previous efforts to obtain pensions. Efforts by the veterans to erect a national monument and to preserve battlefields in Texas were also blocked by Congress in the 1880s and 1890s. Come back to that. Here actually is a monument in Mexico City to U.S. soldiers before there was an equivalent monument in the United States. The big question is why? How was it possible in 1898 to avoid celebrating the Mexican War veteran? Indeed, why was it possible to avoid even talking about America's first war of empire 50 years after it ended? And I think Grant is a player in this, which is why you see an illustration of him here in Mexico. In 1885, former President Ulysses S. Grant, who like most Civil War generals gained key military experience in the Mexican conflict, described the war with Mexico as, quote, one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. He declared the Civil War, quote, our punishment for that transgression. Now, at the time, this view was mainstream. While Grant had been a member of the pro-war Democratic Party in the 1840s and 1850s, he was a Union general and Republican president, and he accepted the anti-war Whig Party as his party's forebears. Although the Democrats promoted and won the war with Mexico, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the party, because ultimately the views of Whigs who maintained the war was unjust, immoral, and part of a land grab on the part of slaveholders held sway. While Republicans were open in their belief that the war was in fact a stain on the nation's honor, and they were generally ready to wave the bloody shirt in order to capitalize on anti-Southern sentiment for political gain throughout the later 19th century, I think it's worth noting that Republicans didn't talk a lot about the war with Mexico. No one did. Why the silence? The North American invasion might be forgotten in the United States, but to many Mexicans it continued to be a matter of pain, shame, and a focal point of hostility towards the U.S.